Hi, in this video we're going to begin our discussion of Unit 11, the last unit of the course, focused on the singular value decomposition. At the end of this unit, you should be able to explain how matrices can be used to store sets of data as well as images. You should be able to explain how the singular value decomposition relates to a sum of rank 1 matrices, and how the singular value decomposition relates to the 4 fundamental subspaces of a matrix. You should be able to use the SVD to find low-rank approximations to matrices, to perform principal component analysis on data matrices, and to be able to compute a pseudo-inverse that can be used to solve linear systems when we have neither full row nor full column rank. We're going to begin our discussion with a brief introduction to a different kind of matrix than those that we have spent most of the class discussing. Really, the vast majority of our discussion in the class has focused on systems of equations. We've looked at problems involving balancing production with demand and resources, economic equilibrium problems, chemical equation balancing, a number of other types of application problem that gave rise to systems of equations that could be expressed in the form AX equals B. We discussed Markov processes and dynamical systems that give rise to systems of equations of the form AXI gives us xi plus 1, where there's a time dependence to the system. In both of these, the matrix A represents a coefficient matrix. The coefficients that are multiplied by the variables x in each of the equations in this system of equations. And we can work with these kinds of systems using elimination, least squares, diagonalization, depending on the problem type. And we found matrix decompositions. A equals LU, A equals QR, A equals X lambda X inverse, LU, QR, and eigenvalue decompositions that could simplify solving these kinds of systems, especially for repeated applications. But matrices also can arise in different situations where we don't really think of them associated with a linear system or a system of equations. That doesn't mean there isn't such a system of equations, but it's not how we naturally think about the problems. Rather, we think of them simply as rectangular arrays of numbers. So let's think about what these data matrices might look like. I have a spreadsheet of data, grading data for the class. These numbers are made up, but the structure of this table is something that is fairly standard. A list of students where every row represents a different student, and a set of columns where each column represents a different assignment or set of assignments, and so on. And there might be a score associated with each assignment for each student. And this table of data can be written in a matrix form, simply taking all of these numbers and just writing them as a matrix. This matrix simply stores this table of data, each column corresponding to score on an assignment, and each row corresponding to a particular student. Now, there are certainly systems of equations that we can set up using this. to find average scores or things like that. But we can also just look at the matrix as a data storage unit, if you will. Matrices of this sort, especially large matrices of this sort, arise in all sorts of different applications. In biology, there are many so-called high-throughput experiments. We do many, many experiments of the same type over and over and over again to generate large data matrices. One example of this is an experiment that measures the expression level, or how active each gene is in different types of cells. There are about 30,000 different genes in the human body, and so we might generate a table, or in the human genome, that we might generate a table that has 30,000 rows. There are about 200 different cell types in the human body. So we might imagine a set of columns corresponding to the 200 different cell types. And experiments can be designed that measure how much of each gene, how much is each gene turned on with maybe some sort of value that represents a measurement of how much this gene is expressed or turned on in each cell. And so we might have genes, for example, that have high values in one type and lower values in some other types. We may have genes that have similar values in all types. We may have genes that have much lower in one and higher in another. We might have other genes, again, that have a similar range of expression in different cell types, but at a different level than another one. We might have genes that have very low expression in most cell types. Right? This sort of data would be encapsulated in a 3,000 by 200 matrix, a big, big matrix. These sorts of large data matrices also turn up in finance and economics. A common source of large data sets in these domains are time series data, where we might have a value associated with an economic readout or a financial readout over time. I could, for example, write down a table that looks at the growth in national domestic product over time. In the table here, measured in quarters, where each row corresponds to a quarter, so 4 per year. The second quarter of 2020, the first quarter of 2020, the fourth quarter of 2019, third quarter, and so on. And this might go for as many years as we have data. If we were measuring things, say, from 1950, that would be 70 years, 4 quarters for every year, 220 rows in this matrix. And we may have columns for different countries. Here shown for North America, the US, Canada, and Mexico, but we could extend this to again, as many countries as we have data for, into the hundreds. Right? Financial data can be expressed in a similar way. You might imagine earnings reports per quarter for various companies. You might imagine stock prices per day, stock prices per minute. And depending on the resolution of the time data, we would have larger and larger numbers of rows, depending on the number of different entities we're looking at, larger and larger numbers of columns. Time series data also turns up in biology, in number of large-scale chemistry and physics experiments, and so on as well. All right. Data like this, large arrays, large matrices, also arise in image processing. Digital images, like you take with your phone, really are simply stored as rectangular arrays of numbers, where the number represents some combination of color and intensity. What the color is and how strong that color should be represented. When we talk about pixels, as most people are familiar with, at least in the context of assessing the quality of their camera, really represents what one element in that array. In fact, the term pixel comes from the name picture element, one element of a picture. So if you think about, say, a 12 megapixel camera, that's what happens to be on my phone. A 12 megapixel camera stores images as the standard format as arrays that have 4,000 kilopixels in one, or sorry, four kilopixels in one dimension and 4 kilopixels, pixels, I guess, in another dimension, giving overall a little bit more than 12 million entries in the matrix. It stores it as these more than 4,000 by 3,000 arrays of numbers, where each of these numbers stores a color and intensity. To visualize this, I'm showing this in a very simplified black and white image, where we might look at this 5 by 5 image that might be a heart or might be a fox, depending on sort of how you decide to squint at it or use your imagination. Could be represented as simply a set of numbers, where zeros represent the white entries and black and ones represent the black entries. It actually turns out that you can, in MATLAB, represent any matrix as an image using the image command. If you just type in MATLAB the term image and then give it some matrix, it will represent your matrix as a picture. Although you need to control, if you just use this by itself, MATLAB will choose the color representation, and that's controllable also. All right. Now, working with data matrices, image matrices, is somewhat different than working with matrices that we think of as systems of equations. One of the problems that we're often looking for in working with these kinds of data matrices is, how do we translate from data, that is the raw data stored in our matrix, to knowledge and understanding? What does the data mean? What does it tell us? This can be lessons about biology from a big data set in biology, insights into how financial systems work in financial data time series, or understanding what an image means. What is the actual picture in an image beyond the raw data of colors in an array of pixels? One of the big questions underlying these problems in data science can be phrased as, how much information really is there in a data set? We have a big set of data that might have millions of numbers. Are all of those numbers independent, or are they related in some way? What are the essential features of that data set? Right? What are the subtle details? Right? In an image problem, what is the picture of? It's a picture of a tree, for example. What are the subtle details? How big is the tree? What season does it seem to be in? And so on. What is noise or error in the data set? And can we actually distinguish between random noise or errors in the data as opposed to subtle details that might be small variations and yet important? Depending on the data, sometimes we can, sometimes we can't. Understanding these our ideas are essential to building an intuitive understanding. We can't wrap our heads around a million individual points of data, but we have a very strong ability to abstract those big ideas down into simple concepts. How do we use the tools of linear algebra to help us do that? That intuitive understanding, the ideas that we use to do so, also are important in terms of recognizing similarities between different sets of data, and in storing data in an efficient way. And we're going to be exploring one key technique that can help us solve these sorts of problems using really not much more in terms of ideas than the concepts that we've already built to date in the class. Right? Let's just sort of give a little bit of an idea of what this sort of problem we might be thinking of. Well, images that are exactly the same size can certainly involve very many different amounts of data. Each of these are 5 by 5 images. One has almost no information, it's simply a gray square. One has a little bit more information. It has differentiated patterns of black and white in a clear pattern. Right? And the second has an additional layer of information built onto it. It has the same pattern of white versus non-colored, but then there's also color representation within here. Different amounts of information, increasing amounts of information as we move from left to right. Data in a matrix can also be organized in very different ways. The rows and columns may be correlated or they may not be, and these different structures of data in the matrix can lead to very, very different meanings. I've highlighted here 3 matrices that have the same set of data. Each of them is structured with 6 students and 3 assignments with a score for each one. And every one of these matrices has 6 entries that are 20, 6 entries that are 50, and 6 entries that are 80. In the first, there doesn't seem to be any correlation between the data. Right? We have rows that have 20, 80, 50. We have rows that have 80, 20, 50. We have rows that have 50, 20, 80, and so on. Looking at the rows and columns, how they relate to each other, I can't make any sense of this. Right? From the perspective of an instructor, I would look at this data and say, this looks like a badly structured course. There's no relationship between how students are doing in the homework, the quizzes, and the exams. And there's no discrimination between different students in the course. Right? These second two matrices are structured in such a way that the data is highly organized. All of the same entry in one column, all of the same entry in another, all of the same entry in the third. I might look at this and say, this also seems a little bit weird from the perspective of an instructor. First of all, the quizzes, and there's this sort of decreasing performance between homeworks, quizzes, and exams. Maybe there's poorly structured in some way. Maybe exams are too hard, for example, and quizzes sort of in between. But also, every student is getting exactly the same score. If every student is getting exactly the same score, it hardly seems that there's a lot of point to evaluating a score for these various tasks. In the last picture, there is a strong relationship between each of the rows. The entries in each row are always identical, but we see discrimination, different entries for different rows. This, at least I can use this to classify students that seem to be doing quite poorly, students that seem to be doing quite well, and students that are performing somewhere in the middle. I would also maybe look at this and say, well, if the homework and quizzes and exams are all giving exactly the same result, are they all necessary? Perhaps not. Looking at the structure of data within in a matrix can give us insight into the underlying problem. So there are many tools that we can use to kind of pick apart data in matrices like these. These are kind of trivial examples, but are sort of set to give you a feel for the kind of problems you might be looking at. In this unit, we are going to be focusing on one particular tool known as the singular value decomposition. It's a matrix decomposition, particularly useful in dealing with data matrices. It's expressed as A equals U sigma V transpose, where U and V are both orthogonal matrices. They are square matrices with orthonormal columns. And sigma is a diagonal matrix of the same size and shape as A. The singular value decomposition can be used to find reduced rank approximations of matrices, identify the so-called principal components of a data set. Both of these can be used for gaining insight into systems, as well as for improved storage of complex large data sets. We can also use the singular value decomposition to compute pseudo-inverses for matrices that are neither full column nor full row rank. And we can use those ideas to solve linear systems. We can also use the singular value decomposition to minimize the error when we're computing the inverse of near singular matrices. Matrices maybe that don't have a determinant of 0, but have a determinant that is very close to 0. And a number of other things. The next video is going to get into exploring exactly how we develop this singular value decomposition, and a third video will introduce us to how we actually use the singular value decomposition to solve some of these kinds of problems. Thank you, and goodbye.